Irish Republic. So it's a pleasure to have you here and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Can everybody hear me? Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Graham. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and thank you very much for those very kind words. I have been fortunate enough to be involved in a number of the processes in Ireland I suppose, in recent, it's almost a decade really at this stage. So what I'd like to do maybe is give a quick overview of what it is that I'm going to talk about today, and then maybe kind of briefly touch upon a number of Graham has already mentioned the Convention on the Constitution, so that's one of the mini publics that has been set up, or that was set up from 2012 to 2014, and I'll talk about the current Citizens' Assembly, but I'd like to give a little bit of background as to how these came about, because I'm sure when I mention participatory and deliberative processes, Ireland isn't always the first place that might come to mind. We're a small, unitary, centralised state, and while we have kind of strong civil society organisations, and nonetheless there have been always challenges. We've been, the local government isn't even particularly strong in Ireland. Okay, so I suppose to give a bit of background, the first point there hopefully will give you a sense why waste to good crisis. So this has all emerged really in the last, really since about 2009, 2010, and that's because of the horrendous crisis that we went through, and what a crisis it was. It wasn't just an economic or financial crisis, it was a political crisis, and we had crisis with our institutions across the board. Our banks failed us abysmally, we'll be paying for that for generations. We went bankrupt, we had to become dependent on our friends in the European Union, the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the IMF had to come in and bail us out. And as a relatively young state, a state that I suppose was fiercely proud of achieving its independence at the beginning of the 20th century, this was a source of huge, I think trauma might actually be the word. So there were a couple of things that emerged at the time. So we had kind of an economic crisis, a severe banking crisis. I mean, we weren't alone in the world with this, but it certainly hit us very, very hard. We're only a small population. And also we began to realise that our political systems had particularly taken their eyes off the ball or their hands off the wheel in terms of regulation and in terms of responding or foreseeing or preventing these crises. And we also, although it's not linked to what I'm discussing today, we also have had institutional crises with the church, etc. Anybody who knows, I suppose, a little bit about us would know that we will be traditionally quite a conservative Catholic country. Okay, so that's what's very interesting about some of the stories I'm about to tell you in the next 5 or 10 minutes. So in some ways, there were those of us, and I'm particularly thinking of colleagues like Professor David Farrell in UCD. Some of you in here probably know David, but there are other colleagues as well. In the Political Studies Association of Ireland, I suppose we were looking at the news on a nightly basis because the whole country, we became obsessed with liquidity funds. We became experts on banking overnight. Thankfully, the little bit of expertise I had, and that seems to have fallen out of my head again. I'm not certain what that says about me or my memory or my interest in banking maybe. But what we noticed was a lot of the commentary and the calls for reform were coming from our economist friends, and there was very little kind of contribution coming from, say, political scientists or space for us to have those contributions about this need for political reform. So within the PSAI, there was a group that emerged in particular that started to say, listen, yes, we need to get ourselves out of this kind of horrendous economic and financial crisis, but we also should take this moment to radically reform. Some of us might have had more radical views than others on this, but to reform our political system to make sure that some of the practices that didn't see this happening or turned a blind eye to it or didn't have the power to prevent it, that wouldn't happen again. So to prevent a repeat of what had happened. So that's what I mean by why waste to good crisis. So this put the idea of political reform on the table. And around that time then, so this was all around 2009, 2010, we began to see I suppose I should declare an interest in some of these things myself. I was on the advisory board of this pilot Citizens' Assembly, but there were other colleagues of mine who were involved in setting it up. So this is We the Citizens. This was a pilot Citizens' Assembly that was set up in 2011 when an Irish-American philanthropist, Chuck Feeney, approached a group of political scientists within the PSAI and said, you have been calling for political reform. David Farrell in particular, because he had been an expert witness at the British Columbian Citizens' Assembly in Vancouver when it was holding its deliberations. He was there because they were discussing the electoral system, and David's background is on electoral systems. So David, for one, had been arguing. There were others supporting, obviously, this call, saying, listen, we need to look at something like a citizens' assembly. Let's give meaningful opportunities for citizens to directly participate. So Chuck Feeney's organised, I think it was Chuck Feeney himself, approached a group of a team of political scientists and said, you're talking about a citizens' assembly. We'll set aside some money for you to see how this would work in an Irish context, because Irish policymakers and politicians were very sceptical of this idea. Yes, the Canadians, the very liberal and moderate Canadians could obviously, and polite Canadians could have citizens' assemblies, but you couldn't have something like that in Ireland, or indeed, could you really give these decisions to citizens? Do you really want the unwashed in a room together? I'm sorry, I'm being very cheeky here now, but there was a healthy degree of scepticism about how something that worked maybe well elsewhere wouldn't necessarily translate to Ireland. So what we, the citizens, did, and they were up against the clock really because a snap general election happened, and we'll talk about that later. So what they did was they had the money, they held 7 regional meetings across Ireland, and out of that they drew their agenda. Then they convened through stratified random sampling, as Graham was mentioning earlier. They randomly selected citizens to participate in a citizens' assembly, and I think it was towards the end of June, on a weekend in Dublin in 2011. And the citizens that weekend, it's not a great photograph, I apologise, the citizens deliberated for 2 days on issues around political reform, so issues of institutional reform, but also they started to discuss issues around services and provision of public services and the link between kind of public services and taxation. And what was very interesting was, as I said, it was a pilot assembly. So really the main outcome of this, or the objective, was to show that Irish citizens could deliberate. And the team that were involved in conducting that experiment, they have published on it, so it's David Farrell, James Soucher and Owen O'Malley. They have published in a number of different journals. I can give you the details if you're interested. And they had 2 separate control groups as well, so it was kind of like deliberative opinion polls. What they did was they controlled for attitudes before and attitudes after the event, and what they basically found, and I'm going to put this in a nutshell because I'm conscious that time will work against me. I tend to talk a lot, and I always find that I'm running out of time. So what they found was that deliberation works. Essentially, people who had come in, people were open to hearing other people's views. They were open to kind of listening to the experts, to questioning the experts, to justifying their own position, as I suppose all the things that we can talk about in deliberation. And that they were open in many cases, to changing their minds. And what the team were able to do was they were able to produce a report, which is still on the We the Citizens website. It's actually it's a really good report. It's a very accessible report, which is, I suppose, which was the main purpose of it. And it said, listen, you know what, in a nutshell, deliberation works. There is no reason why you could not hold a citizens' assembly in Ireland with Irish people. We have the scientific evidence here that has been reviewed by colleagues elsewhere, by peers elsewhere, and we can show to you that deliberation works. So what they did very clearly, I think was on the 2nd or 3rd page, basically said, so we recommend that a citizens' assembly mechanism, particularly for reform programmes, and they're talking here about political reform programmes. So the idea had been that this would happen. We were halfway through a government term, and that this would happen, and then all these findings could be used for the next election. But we actually had a shock election in February 2011, and it's kind of known in the literature in Ireland anyway as it was a kind of earthquake election, because we have 166 deputies in our lower house. The new Parliament ended up with 86 new deputies, 86 people who never walked in the door again. So the leading party, the party that had pretty much been in government on and off, with a few little breaks since the foundation of the state, got a drubbing. It was severely weakened. Needless to say, it is regaining its strength more recently. But so what you saw was there was a shock election. What was interesting, though, in the run-up to that election, all the parties had some form of deliberative or participatory process or citizens-led process in their manifesto, and some of them have gone as far as producing separate policy documents on political reform that included calls for a citizens' assembly or something like a convention on the constitutions. The parties on the left, so for example the Labour Party and Sinn Féin, were looking for conventions that also had a strong role for civil society organisations, and whereas the Fine Gael proposal was kind of replicating what had happened in British Columbia, the 100 citizens. So what we had, anyway, as a result of that election, we had the government that came in as a result of that election was in a very powerful position. It had a very large majority. It was a coalition government. It was Fine Gael, who was kind of a centre-right, conservative, kind of socially conservative party. This is what's very interesting. All this has happened under this party's leadership. So centre-right tends to be socially conservative political party. It was in coalition with the Labour Party, who had, in the run-up to the election, made it very clear that marriage equality was the issue for it, that it was the kind of human rights issue or the civil rights issue for this generation of Irish people. So you had a coalition that were kind of able to work together on many issues, but there were some concerns around some of the social issues, I suppose. In its manifesto, as I said, Fine Gael had committed to a kind of British Columbian 100 citizens randomly selected citizen approach, whereas the Labour Party had called for a convention that would look at the whole constitution. So they were looking at, it was a much larger project, but they were saying it should be 1/3 citizens, 1/3 politicians, and 1/3, I think, from civil society, but representatives from civil society organisations. So what we got was a compromise. So it would be wonderful to say, yes, this was all beautifully thought through, but it was a compromise, I suppose, as with any coalition. And interestingly enough, those of us who were involved, because I was on the academic and legal advisory group to this, there were three political scientists and one legal expert. We advised this convention and worked with it in the run-up to every weekend. There were many of us who were deeply sceptical of the inclusion of the elected representatives. We were very concerned that it would lead to domination. We were concerned we have a very strong party whip system. We were concerned that it would manipulate the outcomes. Interestingly enough, the one person who wasn't concerned was the research director of the British Columbian Citizens Assembly, Ken Carthy, and he said, actually, you know what happened to us in Vancouver was that the politicians stayed too far away, and that caused problems when it came to the referendum, whereas, by having them in the room, you might actually have more impact. And he was correct in many ways. So this is just a photograph of the assembly itself. So 66 citizens, again, stratified random sampling, stratified to the extent that they had to take into consideration geography, gender, age, socioeconomic background, as much as you can with 66 citizens. And certainly there were groups that were excluded. That's not purposely, but they weren't there all the same. So, and 33 political representatives, they were proportionate to their party strength in Dáil, which is our lower house, but also we had parties from Northern Ireland. So this was an actual all-island, even though citizens representatives weren't from across the island, the politicians, the political representatives, included representatives from parties in Northern Ireland. Now the unionist parties chose not to send representatives, which I suppose is somewhat understandable, seeing as they would have seen this constitution as being a constitution of a different state, and they felt they had, that they had no desire to be involved in it. Okay, so it met for 9 weekends. I'll talk about the 9 regional meetings in a second. It had a very eclectic agenda. So it had an eclectic agenda because, again, it was a compromise. And the agenda was it dealt with some kind of very weighty issues, such as, whether or not we would introduce a provision for same-sex marriage in our constitution. Then it also had something like, should we reduce the presidential term of office? Now, our president, and God knows we have a very, we have a wonderful president at the moment, I can say that, can't I? I'm completely exhibiting all my own biases there, but I think even those who mightn't have voted for him are recognising that he's doing a wonderful job. But our president is nonetheless a figurehead. They don't really have great power. So they're a head of state. So you had kind of quite important things, as I said, like introduction of same-sex marriage or marriage equality, to something like the presidential term of office, reduce it from 7 to 5. Wasn't something that people were taking to the streets about, I suppose, let me say. Also, it looked at things like the removal of the offence of blasphemy from our constitution. It looked at reforming our electoral system. It looked at a discussion around, we have a clause in our constitution which was written in the 1930s and was reflective of when it was written, that talks about, that has in the constitution the place of the woman in the home, which in 21st century kind of jars. So these are some of the topics that were considered. They also had some agenda setting power. So the convention, when it was finished deliberating on the 8 topics that were set for it from an Oireachtas resolution, so that's a parliamentary resolution, they had the power then they had the authority to choose other issues of constitutional reform. And what they did to try and get a sense of what they should look at, they held regional meetings, they called for public submissions, and then I think in the end there were 13 topics that came from that, ranging from kind of parliamentary reform to the inclusion of economic and social and cultural rights in the Constitution, to the inclusion of environmental rights in the Constitution, etc. The members voted on what they would choose to look at in the final 2 weekends, and the members, and I suppose this isn't surprising considering some of them were politicians, the members chose to look at parliamentary reform, which actually, funnily enough, was the most heated weekend of all the weekends deliberations. And they also chose to look at the inclusion of economic, social and cultural rights into the Constitution. Okay, so just to give you a sense, what's very interesting about this, I think as well though, and it comes back to the point that Graham was making around institutionalisation, and I was kind of very happy to see that slide there because I've been grappling by what's meant by institutionalising something. This was set up by a resolution of our joint houses of Parliament. And the convention, that resolution committed to a response in the House 3 months after receipt of the reports. Now the government, I suppose, which drives the agenda, the government replied to the first 3 reports quite promptly, and then suddenly it seemed to kind of drop off the agenda. There were 43 recommendations, so they were only actually asked to look at something like 10 topics. But they made 43 recommendations, so the citizens took, all the members took their work very seriously and made many more recommendations, I think, than anybody would have anticipated. 18 of which would require a referendum because constitutionally, if we wish to change our constitution, we have to hold a constitutional referendum. This is the reason why we have had referendums on the Lisbon Treaty, the Nice Treaty, etc. To date, there have been 2 referendums, so you're thinking, well, what's the impact? Many of the recommendations didn't require referendum, so some have come into effect. For example, one of the recommendations was that the chair of our Parliament, of our lower house of Parliament, our Ceann Comhairle, would be elected by a secret ballot, because prior to that it was just within the gift of the largest party. So that's something that's come in recently. We also had, I suppose, and this was the most, I've got a picture even for this, because this was a very historic day, and it's a pity Mrs. Brown happens to be in it, but it was the best quality photo I could find of Dublin Castle and the launch, the official announcement of the result of our marriage equality referendum. This was a hugely significant and emotional day for many Irish citizens, and many Irish citizens actually travelled far to get home to vote in it. Actually, that was one of the issues as well that was discussed, was the right to give Irish citizens resident abroad the right to vote only in presidential elections, national referendums or general elections, but I suppose once you got the foot in the door you might push it a little further. So this was historic. This was historic for two reasons. Firstly, it was historic in the sense, in the Irish Conservative sense, this was huge. This was really, really huge. And it was actually, they say, it was the grandmothers of Ireland that swung this. It was the grands who I suppose were, that's why there's Mrs. Brown, I think, who were persuaded by their grandchildren, particularly their gay grandchildren, that, Granny, why can't I marry? And yes, it's a very interesting one. Also, it was historical in the sense that it's the first time, I suppose, that a referendum has passed successfully from a mini-public. So we had the case in British Columbia. I often feel for the people in British Columbia and that citizens' assembly because they had to achieve a supermajority. This just required a majority. Now, it would have probably met the supermajority because it was 62% voted yes. But this was historic. Interestingly enough, there was a second referendum held on the same day. It was a referendum on reducing the age at which you can run for the office of president in Ireland. So currently you have to be 35 to be eligible to run for president in Ireland. And it was suggested that should be reduced to 21. So it was very interesting on the day when there was a huge kind of boost for equality. It didn't kind of stretch towards age to younger people. So that referendum actually was defeated. A lot of people felt that 21 was too young. And I think part of that debate became like, you could have somebody like Niall Horan running for president. Now, why Niall Horan would want, so this is a pop singer, from One Direction. Why he would even want to run for president, I'm not certain. But, this is kind of the logic that was put out there. Because they're terrified all young people would only want to vote for a pop star. Anyway, so I'm again perhaps being a bit facetious. What is interesting though, since, because the convention came to a conclusion in 2014, interestingly enough, we've been doing work on this and we're hopefully getting it out now in the next 6 to 8 months. There was a concern politicians would dominate the discussions. And every table, so the deliberations took place every weekend in kind of small groups in round tables. And you had roughly, say, 6 kind of regular, ordinary citizen members with 3 politician members, a facilitator and a note-taker. And again, an eye was kept to gender mix, but that wasn't always achievable because, I suppose partly because we have such poor gender representation in our Houses of Parliament. But again, there have been efforts to address that in terms of financing for political parties now linked to gender candidate quotas. What's interesting though, so many of us were getting very fed up that the government had changed. In the meantime, many of the recommendations seem to have been overlooked, put in the back boiler. But recently, we have Fine Gael we have a new Fine Gael-led government, but it is a minority government that has a government with a very loose coalition of independents, and they are a particularly eclectic bunch. I don't know if any of you follow Irish news, but 3 of them had decided last week that they wanted to go to North Korea to start brokering peace talks. While we have the greatest homeless crisis and healthcare crisis of our history. Anyway, needless to say, our Department of Foreign Affairs strongly advised against that trip, however well intentioned. This government is propped up by Fianna Fáil, who happens to also be a centre-right, socially conservative party. We're thinking, so the 2 largest parties pretty much are centre-right. Our divisions are not necessarily left and right, they're kind of coming from our Civil War, the legacy of our Civil War politics. Again, I'm happy to bore you about that if you have any questions. So it's a minority government that's kind of in this confidence and supply arrangement with its old adversaries who are on the opposition benches, but who are also in government and dictating behind the scenes when it comes to certain policies. Anyway, what they have done, though recently our new Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, has come out and has made a commitment to hold referendums in the next anywhere between 10 to 18 months, so in 2018 running into 2019, hold referendums on the removal of the offence of blasphemy from the Constitution, the referendum on the clause on women's place on the home, that's been promised for next year, as has the referendum on blasphemy. It is argued that take place the same day as the presidential election. We have remains to be seen whether or not we're going to have a presidential election, because our current president might just decide to extend his term, but there are others who said they're going to run against him anyway, so it does look like we could have an election. There's also going to be a referendum on voting rights for immigrants, and a referendum to reduce the voting age to 16. So there have been so 4 of the outstanding issues, there now seems to be a commitment to holding referendums on them in 2018 into 2019. What is perhaps the most significant referendum we will face next year comes from this. There has been a commitment, following the first report from this body, there has been a commitment to hold a referendum on repealing the 8th Amendment to the Irish Constitution next year. So what does that mean? If you happen to be in Ireland any time in the next 5 or 6 months, you will see repeal the 8th, T-shirts, repeal the 8th, banners or whatever. The 8th Amendment is an amendment that was put in to protect the life of the unborn child and to give it pretty much equal status as its mother in the Irish Constitution. It has been a hugely controversial, I suppose, clause in the Constitution. It's one that incites great emotion. It has led to some very harrowing medical cases. It has led to loss of life. It has meant, since its introduction in 1983, that we know of 160,000 women have travelled to the UK for terminations. So although we don't have abortion in Ireland, Irish women still have terminations. So anyway, so that referendum has been promised next year, and that is as a consequence of this body. Yes, sorry, I know I talk a lot. Sorry. So that's a consequence of this body. Citizens' Assembly was set up again by the new Fine Gael-led government. This time it doesn't contain representatives, as Graham had mentioned. That's possibly due to kind of political whim, because politicians would be, some politicians in particular, would be absolutely terrified to have to sit down and discuss abortion in this type of forum. Again, the same idea of stratified random sampling, the 5 topics. Interestingly enough, the 2 of the topics that are discussed there are not constitutional issues. Radical recommendations to date. So the recommendations around abortion were unbelievably liberal. They kind of went against what the opinion polls were showing. It was very much in favour of, I think I have the information here coming up. Sorry. What they did was, the recommendation was to remove the article, replace it with a provision that makes termination of pregnancy a matter for Parliament, basically saying to the parliamentarians who didn't want to sit on this, put it in the Constitution. We think it should be taken out, and now it's your job to legislate. But we are going to give you recommendations, and 62% of that Assembly came out and said that terminations should be provided, full stop. That they didn't put any restrictions on it, and there were some recommendations around restrictions as well. So just to give you a sense, 5 weekends, 25 experts, 80 hours of deliberation and 4 ballot papers. There were 6 draft ballot papers, because depending on how the early ballots went, they were sequenced. So it was a significant body of work went into this. The experts did not just include medical and clinical and legal experts, but you also had obviously interest groups represented, like the church, those groups that have been advocating for the repeal of the clause, but you also had the members themselves wanted to hear from women who had been affected by this. So you had personal testimony as well. Okay, so conclusions, right, finally. So to come back, I suppose, to are we seeing institutionalization? What are we seeing here? I suppose, firstly, we've had 2 kind of government-sponsored, or government, because even though they've come from resolutions in Parliament, we have a very tight whip system, so if the government isn't in favour of the process, it's not going to happen. So we've seen 2 government-led and government-responsive kind of deliberative mini-publics. So in terms of impact, I suppose the conventions remains to be seen, as with the Assembly, but they have had some impact. Whether that impact has been felt completely in terms of the education, etc., and information about them outside the room is debatable, but certainly at the moment the recommendation on abortion is being discussed
in an Oireachtas committee, so in the joint parliamentary committee, they are holding 3 months of discussions on the findings that come from the Assembly, and then it's going to go to the floor of the House, and we already have a commitment on a referendum. The question is, what is the question going to be on that referendum? So I suppose a couple of things. I suppose much of what happened in Ireland with regard to deliberative processes, there was kind of a serendipitous element to it. Certainly there was a critical juncture of economic and political crises. I had the privilege of working, I suppose, 12 years ago for a think tank in Dublin that ran a project that was funded by the Joseph Browntree Charitable Trust called the Democracy Commission Project, that looked at issues of reform in Irish democracy. This was in 2005 when things were good. We were the kind of poster boys of Europe because our economy was going up and up and up and up and up and up and up, and many of the commissioners came from all aspects of all parts of Irish society. The commissioners came from political parties, trade union movement, business organisations, etc. They noted a lot they made recommendations around issues around accountability, transparency. They called for Brazilian kind of inspired forms of participatory budgeting at the local government level. The whole thing was completely ignored. People were saying everything is fine. So it took the crisis for a lot of these ideas to kind of take hold. Okay, political reform agenda. Political reform made it onto the agenda, and again, the Citizens' Assembly approach, the direct inclusion of citizens, was part of that political reform agenda. It was one part. There were lots of other parts around, about the investigation powers of committees, etc. And then finally, this is a question I've put out there because I don't know. The Citizens' Assembly was supported by Fine Gael and by some of the independents. It was not supported by Fianna Fáil. Fianna Fáil abstained from voting because if they knew they voted against it, it would fall because of the minority-led government. So they abstained, but they wanted a judge-led commission. Labour, who was kind of very much in favour, the Labour Party and Sinn Féin, who were very much in favour of these types of processes, both voted against because they felt it was the government fobbing off the repeal of the AIDS issue, the abortion issue, onto the long finger, and they said, while you're prevaricating and doing this, hundreds more women will have to travel. So they wanted it just dealt with. And I think, so it's very interesting to see, will this, at the moment, everything that has happened under a Fine Gael-led government. If that government changed, would these kind of tools be seen as a product of it, and therefore abandoned? I hope I'm sorry for going